I was 63 years old when I first realized that my life, everything I had built and believed in, would have to begin again. I had spent decades working with words, ideas, and community projects, believing that education and compassion could heal the wounds of a fractured people. But when Hitler rose to power, all those years of careful progress began to collapse like a wall of sand. Letters from Germany arrived with trembling words and broken sentences, families begging for help, for visas, for a way out. And among them, I saw the same plea again and again, parents desperate to save their children. At first, it seemed impossible. Palestine was not yet a nation but a promisor, place still struggling to grow, still fragile and uncertain. The British controlled immigration, and every visa required negotiation, paperwork, persuasion, yet I could not bear to do nothing. I had seen too many generations lost to despair, too many dreams crushed beneath the weight of history. If we could not save everyone, perhaps we could save the children. The idea of Youth Aliyah youth immigration was not mine alone, but it took hold of me with a force I could not ignore. It began with Richa Freyer, a visionary woman in Berlin, who approached me with her plan to bring Jewish teenagers to Palestine to work on agricultural settlements, to rebuild their lives through labor and hope. I remember listening to her words and feeling both admiration and fear. Could we really uproot children from their families, send them across continents, and promise them a future in a land that was itself still struggling to survive? But I had learned long ago that faith without action was nothing more than a comfort. And so, I began. In 1933, I traveled from Jerusalem to Europe to meet with Jewish leaders, Zionist organizations, and British officials. I carried folders filled with reports, letters, and lists of names of children who needed a future. Every meeting felt like a battle against time. The laws in Germany were tightening, and the window of escape was closing. I would sit across from British officials in crisp uniforms, their desks piled with papers, their tone polite but detached. They spoke of quotas and regulations, of numbers that could not be exceeded. I spoke of faces, of children who had not yet learned to be afraid. When I returned to Palestine, I went straight to the kibbutzim, the collective farms where the Youth Aliyah children would live. I wanted to see for myself whether this land could hold the weight of so many hopes. The air smelled of soil and citrus. The sound of young people working in the fields filled the air. They were strong, sunburned, laughing in Hebrew that still carried the accents of a dozen different lands. Watching them, I realized something essential, that survival was not only about escaping death, it was about building life. The first group of children arrived in 1934. They came with small suitcases, each carrying a photograph, a few letters, maybe a toy. I met them at the port of Haifa. The heat was overwhelming, and the sea glimmered like glass. Many of them were pale and frightened, clutching each other as if afraid to let go. I remember bending down to speak to one little boy who could not have been more than 12. He asked me if his parents would come soon. I had no answer, only the truth. I could not speak that most of them would never see their families again. Those first weeks were difficult. The children missed their homes, the food, the language, the smell of the air after rain. Many cried at night, some rebelled, refusing to eat or work. Others simply stared into space, their eyes too old for their faces. We had teachers and counselors, but no one truly knew how to heal the kind of loss these children carried. I spent every afternoon walking through the fields and dormitories, listening, comforting, promising things I wasn't always sure I could deliver. But as days passed, something began to change. They started planting trees, learning Hebrew songs, sharing stories. Slowly, painfully, they began to believe in tomorrow. Meanwhile, the situation in Europe worsened. Each month brought new restrictions, new dangers. Our letters to Germany were censored. Sometimes, they never arrived. The cost of bringing each child out rose, and the British authorities grew more suspicious of large-scale immigration. But I refused to give up. I wrote hundreds of letters to philanthropists, rabbis, politicians, anyone who might help. I traveled constantly, raising funds, negotiating permits, pleading for more visas. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I was asking too much of people, if I was building false hope. But then I would think of those children working in the fields of Palestine, laughing again, and I knew I had no right to stop. By 1938, Youth Aliyah had rescued thousands, but the shadows in Europe deepened. Kristallnacht shattered any illusions of safety. The letters from Germany now came from basements and hiding places, written in hurried scrawls. Parents begged us to take their children before it was too late. I remember one letter from a mother in Hamburg. She wrote, "If my daughter survives, tell her we loved her more than life." I kept that letter folded in my journal for years. It reminded me why we could not fail. Each rescue was a chain of fragile miracles. Local organizers forged documents or bribed officials. Teachers accompanied the children through borders. Farmers in Palestine prepared new rooms and meals. I coordinated from Jerusalem, often working until dawn, surrounded by maps and lists. My eyesight was failing, and I needed others to read the smallest print for me, but I never allowed age to be an excuse. I had spent my youth fighting for women's education, for public libraries, for hospitals. Now, in my old age, I was fighting for something simpler but far more urgent, the right of children to live. I visited the settlements often. I can still see one moment vividly: a girl sitting under an olive tree, sketching in a notebook. When I asked her what she was drawing, she said, "A house for my family when they arrive." I knew she didn't yet understand that they never would. But her drawing was not a lie. It was a kind of prayer. And that, I realized, was what all of Youth Aliyah was: a prayer, written in action, a vision of what might endure after the storm passed. There were days when exhaustion overtook me. The paperwork was endless, the bureaucracy relentless. Some British officials accused us of smuggling refugees. Others questioned whether these children could ever become productive citizens. I answered with patience, always patience. But inside, I burned with anger. How easily people could reduce human lives to statistics. How effortlessly compassion could be buried under policy. Still, amidst all the frustration, there were moments of quiet triumph. Every time a new transport arrived, I made sure to be there. The children would disembark in groups, clutching their little suitcases, the sea wind tangling their hair. Some would cry, others would stare, in stunned silence, as if unable to believe they were free. We would give them water, bread, and fruit. And sometimes, when the sun began to set, I would step back and watch them play on the shore. Their laughter was the sound of survival itself. But there were also losses I cannot forget. Not every child made it out. Some transports were stopped at borders, some never arrived. I received lists of names crossed out in red ink: children who had vanished into the machinery of the Reich. I carried those names with me, written on scraps of paper tucked inside my Bible. They were my invisible family, the ones whose stories ended before they could begin. By 1939, when war broke out, our work became almost impossible. The seas were dangerous, the borders closed. Still, we managed to bring more groups through neutral countries, through sheer will and courage. I no longer kept count. Numbers had lost meaning. What mattered were the faces, each one a universe. People often called me the mother of Youth Aliyah. I never married, never had children of my own, but I suppose that name was not entirely wrong. I felt a fierce, protective love for those I had helped bring to safety. When I walked among them on the kibbutzim, hearing their laughter, I knew that they were the continuation of everything we had lost in Europe, the living memory of a world that could have vanished. Now, as I look back, I understand that my life was not a series of separate chapters but one continuous thread, woven through time. From my early years in Baltimore to my final days in Jerusalem, it was all one act of faith that education, compassion, and courage could change the course of history. The war would take millions, including many I once knew. But the children of Youth Aliyah endured. They built homes, raised families, planted trees, and turned deserts into gardens. Sometimes, when I walk through the streets of Jerusalem, I hear their voices, grown now, their laughter echoing across the generations. And I think of that little boy who once asked me if his parents would come soon. I never answered him then. But perhaps the answer lies here, in the city he helped build. They did come through him, through all of them. I remember the silence that followed the first news of war. It was not the silence of peace, but of something vast and unspeakable, a stillness that settled over our work like dust. The borders closed, the ships stopped coming, and for the first time in years, I found myself sitting before an empty desk. I would stare at the maps we had used to plan the children's routes: Germany, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and realized that those places had become cages. We had saved thousands, yes, but now, so many more were trapped. Letters stopped arriving. The addresses we had written to were abandoned. The families vanished. Each morning, I waited for the mail, still hoping for word from parents asking if their children were safe. But the silence grew heavier, and I began to understand that I would never hear from most of them again. The work did not stop, it changed. The children already in Palestine needed care, guidance, and strength. They were alone now, most of them orphans without knowing it. I devoted myself to visiting the settlements, speaking with teachers, counselors, and youth leaders. I tried to be everywhere at once, to offer a word, a gesture, anything that could help them believe they still belonged to the world. I was no longer young, my eyesight had grown weak, my hands trembled when I wrote. But every time I saw those children, now teenagers, some already teaching others, I felt renewed. They were growing strong, learning Hebrew, building the foundations of a land that would one day call itself home. And I knew then that Youth Aliyah had become something larger than a rescue mission. It was a bridge between worlds, the lost world of Europe and the one struggling to be born in Palestine. Sometimes, at night, I would walk alone through the streets of Jerusalem. The air was cool, the stones pale under the moonlight. I would pass groups of young people, singing, their voices rising with songs of labor and freedom. And I would think, this is what endurance sounds like, not defiance in anger, but defiance in creation. Then came the reports from Europe, the ghettos, the deportations, the camps. Words that felt unreal, impossible, and yet I knew, deep down, that they were true. I had known what human cruelty was capable of, but even I had not imagined this. The faces of the children we had saved came to me in flashes, the boy from Hamburg, the girl under the olive tree, the first group who arrived in Haifa. Each one was a counterweight against despair. Their existence meant that the future still had witnesses. In those years, I spoke often with the British authorities in Jerusalem, urging them to allow more refugees in, even as the war raged. The struggle was endless. Every visa had to be justified, every life defended in arguments and signatures. I became a negotiator, an advocate, sometimes even a beggar for mercy that should have been given freely. When the British limited immigration, again, I wrote in my diary that night, "It is a terrible thing to watch bureaucracy weigh the value of a child's life, and yet, we found ways, through neutral countries, through secret arrangements, through persistence that bordered on obsession." By the time the war ended, Youth Aliyah had brought more than 11,000 children to safety. Many of them would later tell me that when they arrived, they were too young to understand what had happened. But as they grew older, they realized that their lives were built upon an unspoken promise, made by parents who had sent them away so that part of their love might survive. When peace finally came, it was not the kind of peace I had once dreamed of. The world was changed beyond recognition. 6 million of our people were gone, and Europe was a graveyard of memories. The children we had saved were among the few who could still speak of home. I listened to them tell their stories haltingly at first. Then, with the strength of survivors, some spoke of nights hiding in barns, others of escapes that ended at train stations and borders. Their voices carried the fragments of a broken civilization, and I felt that it was my duty to help them weave those fragments into something new. In the years that followed, I spent my days writing letters, organizing educational programs, and meeting with the young men and women who had once been frightened children at the port of Haifa. Many had joined the kibbutzim, some had gone into medicine or teaching, and others were fighting for the right to create a homeland of their own. They would come to visit Matala now, stronger, and they would call me Ima Henrietta, Mother Henrietta. Each time I heard it, I felt both joy and sorrow. I had never had children of my own, yet I had lived to see an entire generation rise like a forest after the fire. When I was younger, I had imagined my life as a path of intellect and public service. I studied, I taught, I built institutions, and I always believed that progress came from reason. But the war taught me something deeper, that progress also comes from tenderness, from the stubborn will to care, even when the world is falling apart. As I grew older, I spent more time at the Youth Aliyah offices in Jerusalem, where young volunteers worked tirelessly to coordinate the arrival of new groups from the displaced persons camps in Europe. They came with numbers tattooed on their arms, eyes too old for their age, carrying the silence of the camps with them. I would sit with them, listen to their stories, and hold their hands. I could no longer travel as I once did, but I could still offer what time I had left, a voice of reassurance, a promise that their pain was not the end of their story. I remember one boy in particular, perhaps 15, who had lost his entire family in Poland. He sat across from me, his hands trembling, as he told me he no longer believed in God. I told him, quietly, that I understood. I said that perhaps faith was not only in heaven, but in each other. When you plant a tree here, I told him, you are saying that life is still worth the effort. That is faith too. Years later, I heard that he had become an agricultural engineer, helping others plant trees across the Negev. I like to think he found a kind of peace in the soil. The years passed quickly after the war. My health began to fade, but my mind stayed restless. I followed the debates about the future of Palestine, the creation of a Jewish state, and the hope for peace with the Arab people who shared the land. I had lived long enough to know that every dream came with a burden, but I believed that the people we had saved, the children who had grown into builders, teachers, and soldiers, would carry that burden with wisdom. Sometimes I would sit by the window of my room and watch the sun set over Jerusalem. The light turned the stone walls golden, and the city seemed to breathe with history. I would think of all the children I had met, scattered now across the land, raising families of their own. I imagined them telling their children where they had come from, the journeys they had taken, the people who had helped them. And I realized that this, more than anything, was the meaning of memory: not to dwell on the pain, but to keep love alive through action. There is one moment I still think about often. It was in 1944, in the middle of the war, when a group of Youth Aliyah graduates visited me in Jerusalem. They brought with them a small tree to plant outside my window. One of them said, "You taught us that life can always begin again." As they placed the sapling in the earth, I felt something shift inside me. The tree was young and fragile, but its roots took hold quickly. Today, it stands tall, a silent witness to all that came before. I sometimes wonder how history will remember me, perhaps as an organizer, a reformer, a founder, but in truth, I think of myself as a seamstress of lives, taking torn threads and stitching them together so that something whole might emerge. I was not a saint or a hero. I was simply someone who could not turn away. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the harbor of Haifa, as it was in those early years, the ships arriving, the children stepping off, blinking into the sunlight. I can still hear the sound of their voices, the shuffle of their feet on the dock, the first uncertain laughter as they realized they were safe. It is that sound I carry with me, not the speeches, not the meetings, but that first breath of freedom. As I near the end of my life, I think less about what was lost and more about what endured. The children we saved are now the parents and grandparents of a nation. They teach their children the songs they once learned in fear and hope. They plant trees, build homes, argue, dream, and love. They live, and that is enough. People often ask me whether I believe the world can truly change. I think it can, but not through grand declarations or wars. Change begins in the smallest acts, in the decision to protect a stranger, to open a door, to believe that a child's life is worth saving, even when the world insists otherwise. When I die, I know there will be no great monument for me, but perhaps somewhere, in a field in Israel, a young boy or girl will walk past a tree planted long ago and feel, without knowing why, that someone once believed in their future. That will be enough. Because in the end, what we save is not only lives, it is the possibility of goodness itself. And as long as that possibility exists, there will always be hope.